So welcome to Chatham House, ladies and gentlemen. If I could just say a couple of boring things at the beginning. Could you please make sure that your cell phones are switched off and not just on buzz or anything of that sort, because it'll interfere. And also, in case it wasn't completely abundantly obvious, this is not under the Chatham House rule. It's our great pleasure to be able to host, in association with Avaaz.org, this first speech by the new Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable David Miliband MP. David Miliband, as you all know, was appointed Secretary of State Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs last month as part of Gordon Brown's first cabinet. It's been a pretty meteoric rise. He entered Parliament as MP for South Shields in 2001. In 2002, he became Minister of State for Schools. In 2004, Minister for the Cabinet Office. And he entered the Cabinet as a Minister of Communications and Local Government after the May 2005 election, and headed up the Department for Food, Environment and Rural Affairs from May 2005. But before he even entered government, Miliband was part of the broader policy community. He earned his Master's in Political Science at MIT and was one of the founders of London's Centre for European Reform. He brings, therefore, I think, a creative as well as a practical dimension to the leadership of Britain's FCO. Before I turn over the Foreign Secretary, let me also turn the podium first to Rikan Patel, the head of Avaaz.org. In a way, our two organizations, I think, encompass the constituencies between which leading politicians are increasingly having to mediate today. Those constituencies of the policy specialists and issue specialists, and those of the broader democratic community that are increasingly involved in trying to get their voice heard in international affairs. So we're delighted to have you with us as well, Rikan. The podium is yours.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, Avaaz.org members are extremely excited about this opportunity. Traditionally, foreign policy has been principally the domain of interests and experts and nations, and I think increasingly it's becoming a domain of values and democracy and humanity. Avaaz means voice in many languages. Our mission is a simple democratic one, which is to organize citizens around the world to close the gap between the world that we have and the world that we want. Revolutions in technology are allowing citizens to connect across borders like never before and engage in public life. And in just 6 months, Avaaz has grown to over 1.2 million members who join us in this room today via webcast. We asked those members if they had any questions for David Miliband, and we've had thousands submitted over the last few days, and they continue to stream in. We found that there was a great deal of agreement among those voices on issues ranging from climate change to human rights to global poverty to the crisis in the Middle East. And we hope and trust that David Miliband's new diplomacy is a sign not just of how he intends to listen, but how he intends to lead. And if it is, then we're confident that the weight and legitimacy of global public opinion will stand solidly behind him. There's been a lot of hope surrounding the new British Prime Minister and Cabinet on all these fronts. As one of the youngest cabinet members in history, the first government minister to keep a blog, and someone who even reportedly has an avatar on Second Life, those of us engaged in people-powered politics have much hope that David Miliband in particular will bring the kind of democratic leadership that the world needs, wants, and demands. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Miliband.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Robin and Rikan. I'm always worried when I get introductions that build up this youth and breadth and even creativity you were kind enough to say, because the first ever visit I did as a government minister was in 2002, when 2 days after I became schools minister for schools, I was back in my constituency for a meeting, an assembly, where I was giving out some prizes, St Mary's School in South Shields, and the headmistress obviously felt a similar degree of excitement. Perhaps she met me at the gate. She said, "We're all so pleased that you're here. Please come into the assembly hall." And there were 150 kids. They were sitting on the floor. They didn't have the chairs that you are given here, and they were sitting very attentively, and she gave the sort of introduction that you've just given, and she said, "Can anyone tell us who our distinguished visitor is?" And there was this sort of silence across the room, and she said, "Now, children, we did practice this yesterday." can anyone tell us who our very distinguished visitor is, a man of creativity and insight who's going to make a big difference to our... I'd arrived, sort of, first visit as a government minister, feeling quite sort of pleased with myself, I suppose. By this stage, I was sort of getting smaller. The poor headmistress was sweating away, and in a rather sort of pleading tone, she finally said, "Now, children, someone must be able to tell us who our very distinguished and important visitor is, someone who's going to make a big difference to our schools, someone who, well, it's going to be a really practical supporter of the work we do." And finally, this little boy put up his hand. He must have been sitting sort of just a few rows back, and she said, "Yes. Miss, is it the man who's come to fix the electricity?" And from that moment onwards, I've known exactly how to take with a pinch of salt the introduction. Nonetheless, I'm very grateful for the very kind introductions that you should have given. I should probably say at the outset, some of you, I hope, have come here because I'm giving my speech about the new diplomacy and challenges for British foreign policy. Some of you may have, maybe especially our friends from the media, may be here because of events that are going on in London and in Moscow. I think I should say at the outset that I've given a statement outside the Foreign Office today in response to the Russian announcements, and I'm not proposing to depart from the speech that I'd prepared. I hope to rattle through in good enough time to allow plenty of time for questions, both from the audience here and via the blogs and websites, and also to get away so that I can catch the 5:30 train to South Shields, where I'm due to present the award, the Pride of South Tyneside Awards tonight. So if I can manage to achieve all those things, I'll have hit all my performance objectives for the day. I think this is a really important and exciting time for Britain and for British politics. After 10 years in government, the Labour Party is seeking, under new leadership, to set out and deliver a renewed vision for the future of the country, a vision that builds on the economic, social and political changes that have happened since 1997. And it's my belief that the battle of ideas over the next couple of years is going to determine the future of the country over the next 10, 20 or 30 years. I think the stakes are very high indeed. And I would describe them as follows. The question that we're going to have to address, the question that will be resolved by this battle of ideas. Will progressive forces establish a new centre of gravity in politics in Britain? Or will the 20th century pattern of conservative dominance, conservative with a small c and conservative with a large c, the conservative dominance that was so marked in the 20th century and only interrupted by bursts of radicalism, continue to be the norm for the 21st century. And today I want to address the relevance of foreign policy to the drive to build a better Britain, the relevance of the priorities for foreign engagement, and the powers available to us to advance our goals. And in that context, I just want to pick up what Robin and Rickon have both said. I think it is symbolic that I should be giving my first speech as Foreign Secretary to and with organisations that symbolise the best of the old and the best of the new in foreign policy, the insight, knowledge and expertise of Chatham House, and the capacity for engagement with people on a global scale offered by and demonstrated by Avaaz. Now, every Foreign Secretary who I've ever read about quotes Lord Palmerston, who famously said that we, Britain, have no permanent allies and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. But although every Foreign Secretary quotes that famous phrase, I want to ask, is it true? Today, actually, we do have permanent alliances. The US is the single most important bilateral relationship. We are members, committed members of the European Union. We are proud of our role on the Security Council of the UN, proud of the Commonwealth too. These alliances are founded on shared values and embedded in shared institutions. And the evolution in foreign policy is driven, in my view, by changing circumstances and the changing distribution of power, not by changes in values and alliances. This evolution depends on new thinking and on new solutions. And this is the argument that I want to put to you today. First, that Britain needs to respond to the real insecurities and opportunities that exist in the world not by retreating from international engagement, but by using our strengths so that we are a force for good for Britain by being a force for good in the world. The old distinction between foreign policy that affected foreigners and home policy that affected our own citizens has collapsed. So foreign policy is about values, but it's also about interests. It's about values and interests together. Second, I think Britain brings to this task real strengths, a new Prime Minister with a very clear view of how the national interest is best served by international engagement, an economy that is increasingly the banker to the world, culture that is globally admired, ditto military forces, and alliances that stretch north, east, south, and west. Third, foreign policy goals and methods must adapt to a series of shifts in the distribution of power, a world where the security threat is not just from excessive state power, but increasingly from terrorism and conflict within failed states, a world where economic prosperity depends on new bargains between industrialized and developing countries, a world where social change is fostered not just through government-to-government relationships, but between businesses, NGOs, and faith groups. In this context, fourthly, we need to think how we can deploy Britain's assets, both the soft power of ideas and influence and the hard power, the harder power of our economic and military incentives and interventions to promote the international security and prosperity on which we all depend. Fifth and finally, I want to argue that this new diplomacy can begin in the Foreign Office, but it needs to draw on the widest base of ideas. And I want to end tonight by setting out the questions that I am asking in the Foreign Office, that I'm asking in staff meetings and in seminars. And I want us to address those questions together in the seminar rooms of Chatham House, but also among the million members of Avaaz. Let me just start, not with foreign policy, but with the fact that I am a departmental minister, but I'm also a member of the government. So it's important that I start, I think, from the overall aims of the government and then explain how I think foreign policy fits into them. The new government's project is focused in three key areas, all of which, I believe, require an active foreign policy. First, our prosperity relies on a more open Britain, open to new investment and trade, to new people and ideas. In the 21st century, I think that successful countries of the world will be those that are most open in their social structures, more open in their political structures, above all, most open to the talent of individual citizens, whatever their background. Second, the Brown government's vision of how we build security for our country relies on tackling instability and injustice at home and abroad. It requires cooperation with countries on terrorism, migration, and organised crime. It requires collective action on the great existential threats, from nuclear proliferation to climate change. And third, our mission to give power to people to shape their lives does depend on local accountability that successive statements in the House of Commons from domestic policy ministers have outlined over the last 3 weeks, but it also depends on global institutions, global agreements, and global links. The vision is summed up in the idea of Britain as a global hub. Just as the City of London acts as the centre of the global financial market, British cities and institutions and ideas can become the hubs for scientific, cultural, and political collaboration. But that vision needs to be delivered in different and new circumstances, and therefore needs new tools. And it's those circumstances and those tools that I want to address now. I think it's obvious that the environment for diplomacy has been affected by a series of shifts in the distribution of power at international level. When I was at university, it was still the case that people talked about, quote-unquote, balance of power as the basis for diplomacy. Today, the new diplomacy needs to reflect big changes in the distribution of power. I think there are 4 really important points that strike me, anyway. First, for much of the last century, our security concerns were primarily about excessive and expansionist state power, threatening their own systems or citizens or neighbouring countries. Today, some of the greatest threats are likely to emerge in countries where state power is too weak, not too strong. The implication, I think, is clear. Building the capacity of states must go hand in hand with building democratic accountability. while we've actually seen a substantial reduction in the size of conventional and nuclear arsenals since the end of the Cold War, it's striking that the sense of insecurity felt by our citizens hasn't reflected that diminution in the size of conventional and nuclear arsenals. That sense of insecurity has probably increased. Across the world, people are demanding more power for themselves, but our task is to make this a force for progress, for coordination, for connection, not a force for destruction. Second shift in the distribution of power is that over the next 2 decades, with the growing strength of China and India, we're likely to see political, economic, and military power more geographically dispersed than it has been since the rise to global dominance of the European empires in the 19th century. This makes our most important bilateral relationship with the United States more, not less, important. It makes the case for our leading role in the European Union and NATO more obvious than ever. It makes our membership of the Security Council, and therefore our work with Russia and China, more vital than ever. It makes our determination as a government to champion UN reform, with Security Council membership for a larger group of countries, more relevant than ever. And it actually offers a new basis for a vibrant Commonwealth as a unique network of nations. Third, I think it's also obvious that there's a mismatch between national power and some important global problems. The risk of financial crises, climate change, and health pandemics cannot be mitigated by individual countries alone. They require collective action on a regional and global scale. Managing the risks from globalization and maximizing the benefits requires institutional innovation. And I think the development of the EU, sometimes a halting and faltering development, but the development nonetheless, reflects this. Fourth, the power to coordinate at scale, which historically has done by hierarchies in bureaucracies or through price mechanisms in markets, is now also being done without the helping hand of the state or the invisible hand of the market, but instead, as Rickon said, through the technology that enables networks to challenge the power of traditional incumbents, economically and politically. In benign forms, you can see it with Linux challenging Microsoft Windows, Wikipedia challenging Encyclopedia Britannica, or political campaigns like Make Poverty History, Stop Climate Chaos, or Move On. Less welcome, obviously, is that these networks are not only available to forces that want to connect people and work together to solve common problems. Also present is the increasing capacity of extremists and terrorists to coordinate their disparate activities without the vulnerability of a single point of control. The power of technology to connect people across the world needs to be put to strategic good use. Now, what do these 4 shifts in the distribution of power mean? I think they mean the following: that we need to change the way we analyze threats and exploit opportunities. Our security is threatened by terrorist networks using the freedom of an open society, but our security can be enhanced by the spread of democracy and by good governance. Our prosperity is threatened by climate change, but can be enhanced by free trade. Our sense of powerlessness is exacerbated by the weaknesses of international institutions, but can be diminished by the potential of new networks. In other words, there are new sources of insecurity in the modern world, but also new resources, the flip side of these dangerous forces, new resources for prosperity. And this has implications not just for foreign policy priorities, but how we go about pursuing them. If we as a country are to continue to be a force for good, we need to be smart about how and when we combine the soft power of ideas and influence and the harder power of economic and military incentives and interventions. The first source of power, set out by the Prime Minister, is winning what he calls the battle of ideas. I want to try and unpack that a bit. What do we mean by the battle of ideas? I think first we mean that we have to be clear about our objectives. Our objective is not domination. It is not to force others to live as we do. In a world as diverse and complex as ours, it is to establish, on however thin a basis, a set of rights and responsibilities by which we can live together in all our complexity and all our diversity. Our aim must be to galvanize all the resources of moderation to block the path of radical extremism. Nowhere is this more the case than in the Middle East and in the drive for a two-state solution there, a point I'll return to later. We need also to be clear, not just about objectives, but about values. For example, the declaration at the World Summit in 2005 that the international community has a quote-unquote responsibility to protect populations from genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity marks a vital new stage in the debate about the relationship between human rights and national sovereignty. So we're right, in my view, to work urgently to avoid a repeat of the 1990s catastrophe in the Balkans by backing the Ahtisaari plan for Kosovo strongly, which I discussed with Foreign Minister Steinmeier and Foreign Minister Kushner yesterday. The battle of ideas also means being clear about facts and evidence, such as whether it's in our financial self-interest to tackle climate change. I believe it is in every country's financial self-interest to tackle the threat of climate change. The Stern Review showed that the UK can have a major impact on debates across the globe by reframing climate change as an economic as well as an environmental issue. So I think that my predecessor, Margaret Beckett, was profoundly right to take the debate for the first time about climate change into the Security Council, to reflect the importance of climate change to international security. And I think we need to find similar ways of leading thought in other areas, whether this is concrete and immediate challenges, such as nuclear disarmament and proliferation, or longer-term challenges, such as the future of global institutions. The second source of power is influence within institutions. Britain acting alone does not, obviously, possess the power or legitimacy to directly affect change on the scale required. Acting with others, we can make a difference. I think it's really important to say multilateralism is not a soft option. Just look at Afghanistan, a country that symbolizes our dual goal of protecting our national security and at the same time promoting human rights and sustainable development. Our military forces are deployed as part of NATO operation involving over 30 countries backed by a UN mandate. The military operation is itself backed by a comprehensive approach including EU and UN investment in development and humanitarian assistance. So soldiers and diplomats and aid workers are working side by side across Afghanistan to help give that country a chance of stability, security and prosperity. I think it's right to ask what multilateralism means for our bilateral relationships. My view is that it does not replace the need for bilateral relationship. If we want Britain to be a global hub, we need a strong relationship with the leading global power. The US is our single most important bilateral partnership, yes, because of shared values, but also because of political reality. The US is the world's largest economy, engaged, whether on the Middle East peace process or climate change or international development. It has the greatest capacity to do good of any country in the world. That is why, for example, we welcome the commitment of President Bush to give priority to long-term political negotiation on a two-state solution, side by side with short-term humanitarian and other support for the Palestinian government, led by President Avaaz and Prime Minister Fayyad. Some people are trying to compare our relationship with the US with our position in the EU. Let me tell you my view. The EU is not a bilateral relationship. We are members of the European Union. That membership is an asset in economic terms, where it guarantees open markets and setting common standards where needed. It's an asset in tackling crime, and it needs to be a greater asset in foreign policy, not substituting for nation states, but giving better expression to the common commitments of nation states. That's why we support the proposal to amend the EU treaties so that we have at our disposal a single representative to take forward our common foreign and security policy, where all 27 member states wish to act together and give authority to do so. It just makes sense. All multilateral institutions need a strong sense of purpose. Remember, the EU was founded to tackle a threat that no longer exists, in my view, conflict within Western Europe. If it's to renew its mandate, it needs to find a new raison d'etre, including, I believe, a focus on addressing one of the greatest threats to our future prosperity and security, climate change. Creating an EU as an environmental union is as big a challenge in the 21st century as peace in Europe was in the 1950s. Our long-term challenge, obviously, is to adapt and strengthen other multilateral institutions and networks to renew their mandates, reform the way they work, and adapt more quickly to threats and new opportunities. Now, if it's right that ideas and influence are examples of so-called soft power, then the third source of power, incentives and sanctions, represents harder power, and we should be ready to use them to maximum effect. history suggests that the attraction of becoming members of clubs such as the World Trade Organization, NATO, or more profoundly the EU, is a powerful one. The benefits of free trade or military protection, when linked to states playing by the rules, can incentivize reform and establish norms of behavior. I want to give you an example. I am personally a strong supporter of Turkish accession talks with the EU. The prospect of EU membership has built a very important bridge to a key Muslim country. But it has also, in recent years, helped contribute in that country to the abolition of the death penalty and improved rights of women and minorities. A balanced package of incentives and sanctions are also required to apply pressure. In my view, Iran has every right to be a secure, rich country, but it doesn't have a right to undermine the stability of its neighbours. That's why we're taking a dual-track approach. We're continuing to discuss further sanctions with the group of nations that comprise the E3+3, an international coalition brought together to address the dangers of Iran's nuclear program. In parallel, through the E3+3 process, we're offering a comprehensive package of incentives. It's worth just rehearsing briefly what they are. It means reaffirming Iran's right to nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination and in conformity with Articles 1 and 2 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, improving Iran's access to the international economy, markets and capital, and support for a new conference to promote dialogue and cooperation on regional security issues. Fourth and finally, there will be cases where direct intervention will be right. And this can take a range of forms: aid convoys, police training of security forces, or deploying peacekeepers. In some areas, however, military intervention will be necessary. It was right in Kosovo in 1999 to deal with the terrible ethnic cleansing going on there. Almost a decade later, I believe it's right that the UN and the African Union are working together to put a strengthened force into Darfur to protect vulnerable citizens there, and right too that under French leadership, the EU is working on deploying a small military force on the Chad-Darfur border. In Iraq, the Prime Minister has made clear that we will fulfill our international obligations and our obligations to the Iraqi people. Our objective is to support a democratically elected government. Our roles are defined by UN resolutions. Our current efforts are directed towards the development of a strong Iraqi security capacity and the political reconciliation that we know must be at the heart of progress. In other words, across those four areas, we have a range of tools at our command. The changing distribution of power in the world means we must be a force for good by virtue not of choosing hard or soft power, but by combining both. In a world of conflict within states, national sovereignty is no answer to complaints about the systematic abuse of human rights. In a world where challenges cut across country borders, we need more than ever to build regional and global institutions that are more effective and legitimate. And in a world where power to destroy is greater, we need both economic incentives and guarantees of security, combined with a continued role for hard power interventions. I think this agenda creates big challenges for the organisation I lead, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Britain, under Gordon Brown's leadership, has the strength to make a difference in the world, and thereby make a difference to Britain. My job is to ensure that the FCO makes the most effective contribution to that drive. After 3 weeks in the job, I'm more confident than ever about one thing, that we have the people to make a difference and to be successful. But after 3 weeks, it's also right to share with you the questions I'm asking about how the Foreign Office can make the greatest contribution. First, priorities. Given the levers I've just described, where should the UK concentrate its global effort? Where are we most needed and where can we most affect change? At the moment, the Foreign Office has 10 strategic priorities. All are important. But can any organisation really have 10 priorities? There are important public services amongst those priorities that support British nationals and British business overseas, from our consular and visa services to the UK TI. But policy priorities need rigour and they need clarity. My starter for 10 is that in the coming month we must focus first on helping to tackle the causes and consequences of extremism, radicalisation and conflict. Second, we must shape a sustainable global response to the challenge of climate change and the need for low-carbon economic development around the world. And third, we must build a more effective EU to help build prosperity within its borders and security beyond. But I put those on the table for discussion, not as a new white paper announced today. Second, There's the issue of cooperation across UK government. The Foreign Office, I said on my first day in office, just after I'd been appointed, is, in my view, a unique global asset. But diplomacy has to be allied to other assets across government, in particular aid, trade, investment, military intervention. How can we improve coordination across the FCO and other departments on particular countries and particular challenges? It's up to us to address that. Third, there's a question for you. How we can engage beyond Whitehall with faith groups, NGOs, businesses and universities. The old diplomacy was defined by a world of limited information. It was a secret garden of negotiations. And secret negotiation still matters. But we live in a world where the views of a Pashtun farmer and the conflict he faces between illegal opium production and legal farming hold the fate of a critical country in the balance. So the new diplomacy has to be public as well as private, mass as well as elite, real time as well as deliberative, and that needs to be reflected in the way we do our business. Let me finish on the following point. My predecessors in the Foreign Office, or at least that part of it which was the colonial office, looked out on an empire. That is no longer the case and never will be the case. But since the decline of empire, Britain has faced a very stark choice: to engage with the world or to retreat from it. I'm clear about my answer, and perhaps simply by your attendance here, you're clear too. We must engage. But those of us committed to engaging with the world have faced profound questions, and still face profound questions, about how we engage. And that's what I've tried to address today. The greatest dangers we face are not actually those of practicality. The greatest dangers we confront in our drive for engagement is actually skepticism and fatalism. And I think that President Kennedy, speaking in the early 1960s, got this right. He said that foreign policy should be based on idealism without illusions. In this speech, I've tried to speak without illusions about the challenges and about the difficulties. But the idealism is still there, above all, about Britain's ability to be a global hub which lives out its values at home and advances them abroad. The job of the Foreign Office is to lead that debate, and with your help, that's what I'm determined we will do. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Thanks for those comments. Just while we sort of gather ourselves, let me quickly just recap a couple of the points that I thought were especially interesting there. You talked about a foreign policy driven by values as much as interests. You talk about the security concerns we've heard being driven not just by the power of states, but also by weak states and their rise, or at least their collapse. And also the comment about the power to coordinate at scale, the kind of capacity that either organizations, for good or for ill, are able to use. Perhaps, a couple of comments that will perhaps tease both our audience here and the audience that Avaaz.org has got. Your comment about multilateralism not replacing bilateralism, that the United States has the greatest capacity of any country to do good in the world. An important statement. Also your statement that the EU is not so much bilateralism, but we're members. And then perhaps, just for those who didn't catch them quickly, as those 10 strategic priorities became a notional, perhaps, idea of 3, you talked about tackling the causes and consequences of radicalization, global responses to climate change and a low-carbon economy, and a more effective EU that can project prosperity inside and outside. And I thought those were all critical comments. Now, what we're going to do is open up to some questions to the audience, and also we will, I'll then turn it over to Rickon to draw in questions from his audience. I'm going to start with some here. If you can put up your hands, I'll take as many as I can in the time that we've got here. Yeah, Bridget? Is it? Yeah.
Foreign Secretary.
If you hold the microphone up, please, just so. Yeah, thank you.
We'll take in groups 3 and then we'll be able to get through as many as possible.
Foreign Secretary, you talked about the need for Britain to engage in the world. One country that's on everyone's minds today is, of course, Russia, and Britain's relations with Russia, with the news that Russia's going to expel 4 embassy staff from the embassy in Moscow. So the question is, where do you see Britain's relations with Russia heading? And specifically, what action would you like to see from Britain's partners in the EU and in the United States to support the United Kingdom in its disagreement with Russia on this matter?
So let me take another here. John, at the front, please. There's a microphone just coming. Just give us 1 second, because there's everyone else here. There it is. It's right there next to you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Foreign Secretary John Snow, Channel 4 News. You spoke of our most important bilateral relationship being that with the United States. It's a people-to-people and somehow became also a White House to Downing Street relationship. Was there any sense in which you felt it was out of kilter, in a way in which it will now change? And most specifically, it is said that you were opposed to Britain sitting on its hands during the Israel-Lebanon war. Is that true? And is it a manifestation of the bilateral relationship getting out of kilter?
Definitely want a third? These are all,
Yeah,
what do you want
let's
to
do a third.
Okay. Over
Foreign
there.
Secretary.
Sorry, Farquhar first, and I'll come back to you. Sorry. I'm trying to move around the room a bit.
Yeah, Kerry Brown, Chatham House. I deal with China from here. I just wanted to ask you a question about China and the environment. Obviously, China is now probably the world's biggest polluter. Do you have any fresh ideas on how you can mediate between the US and China? Because the US obviously has some issues with the global climate change. Have you got any sort of fresh perspectives or fresh ideas about how to deal with that problem?
Whenever politicians say they want to take three questions together, that generally means that you can avoid the difficult ones. But it's quite difficult when they're all difficult. First of all, in respect of Britain's relations with Russia, we want strong, productive relations with the Russian government and the Russian people. Those relations need to be based on clear rights that come from membership of the international community and clear responsibilities as well. I've said this afternoon outside the Foreign Office that we were disappointed that there's been no signal of greater cooperation from the Russian Federation in respect of the extradition that we are seeking. And I've also said that we see no justification for the retaliation in respect of 4 hard-working embassy staff, and we'll do everything in our power to protect them and their families. I also said that over the last 36 hours, we've seen some very significant statements from European countries and from the European Union as a whole, and from the United States as well, supporting very strongly the British desire to see the integrity of our justice system protected. And I stand by what I said in my statement to the House of Commons on Monday, which is that we have clear aims in respect of this particular case, but we are also clear that we have strong shared interests with Russia and we want to develop them. In respect of the United States, I think I addressed that pretty clearly in the speech that I've just given John. The Foreign Office strategic plan that was published last March, said very clearly it was our single most important bilateral relationship, and that is for reasons of values, but also reasons of political reality. We are members of the European Union. I don't see a choice between the two. In respect of the Lebanon war last year, I was asked this by the Financial Times 10 days ago. My first caution would be reports of cabinet meetings are not things that cabinet ministers comment on for obvious reasons. What I've wanted to say on this, I've said on the record, and I stand by what I've said on the record, I think in the New Statesman last September. In respect of China, I used to spend when I was Environment Secretary, I used to say that the battle against climate change needed to be not just a matter for environment ministers, but prime ministers, chancellors, and foreign ministers. And now that might seem like a rather self-serving thing to have said. It wasn't intended to be self-serving, but I do think it's a foreign policy issue. I discussed this with Foreign Minister Steinmeier yesterday. In respect of the US and China, my 3 rules for getting this climate change deal done are: first, it's got to be a matter of prime ministers, not just environment ministers. Secondly, it's got to be in the financial self-interest of every country. And that's why I think it's significant that the business community in the United States should be working so strongly on this issue. Now, 11 major companies came out 3 or 4 months ago. Governor Christ in Florida just this month has launched an 80% CO2 reduction plan by 2050. That's significant. On the Chinese side, I think the publication just about a month ago of the Chinese action plan on energy efficiency is important and significant. So the second thing is it's got to be in the financial self-interest of every country. Thirdly, we need demonstration projects that show new technology to be delivering low-carbon solutions. And one of the most important things that's happening at the moment is what was originally a UK-China partnership, now an EU-China partnership on the near-zero emissions coal project. Because the truth is, there's a coal-fired power station being built every 5 or 6 days in China, or opened every 5 or 6 days in China. There's 160 coal-fired power stations, I think, in the pipeline in the United States. If we can't make carbon capture and storage the norm in the future, then we're going to struggle very, very hard to meet our energy needs and our climate requirements. And that's why the European Union's determination in this area is important. Sorry, my answers are too long. I'll try and
Actually,
brief.
your question was very good. Rick, to you.
So we'll take some questions from the virtual audience to the speech now. We've had thousands of questions submitted, so apologies to all those who can't get them in. But the first one I'll take is from Hassan Naeem in Pakistan. I'm a tax lawyer and 37 years old, married with 2 children. Being a Muslim and especially a Pakistani, I would ask Mr. Miliband to review Great Britain's policy concerning the war against terror. Britain has paid a lot fighting against the Muslims, or the terrorists as they say. Our concern is that one should try to eliminate the causes that generate terrorists. These are the policies that make this world a peaceful place or a place full of miseries.
Do you want to do 2?
Sure. Actually, we'll probably take 3 then. The second question is from Derek Wogu in Nigeria, a chartered accountant. He asks, Dear Sir, what strategy do you plan to adopt in driving the process of eradicating global poverty? And then I think the third question we'll take is from John Steinberg in the United States. Do you support the Saudi-led Arab plan for Arab recognition of Israel in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem?
Well, I think the first thing to say, that is new diplomacy, isn't it? I mean, that is fantastic. Really good questions. And the first question, it is really important that we have these sort of occasions to engage about this, because the questioner talked about us fighting against Muslims. That's not what we see ourselves doing, and that's not what we believe we are doing. There are some people committing terrorist acts in the name of Islam, but our absolute determination is to build the sort of world that I described, where different cultures, different religions can live side by side with some clear rules for that sort of coexistence. And I would say, what was the name of the question?
Hassan Naeem.
I'd say to Mr. Naeem that I would really like the sort of dialogue that's going to be able to take place on your websites, to be able, for me to understand why he says that's the case, why he believes that we're waging a war against Muslims, and me to be able to say things like the terrorist attacks in Britain are aimed, or do in fact, kill Muslims as well as Christians and Jews and those of no religion. I'd like to be able to say that there are Muslims in Britain who consider themselves devout Muslims but also proud Britons. I'd like to be able to talk to him about what happened in the 1990s in Bosnia and about the intervention there. So I hope that we can frame that dialogue. But what I would want to say to him above all is that I don't recognise this as a fight against Muslims. I believe we've got a fight with millions and millions of Muslims who want to lead devout but also civilised and enriching lives, and we need to do that together. Derek in Nigeria, asked me what's my plan for global poverty. I think that, in a way, when we were elected first to government in 1997, countries were falling so far behind on the UN's target for a 0.7% of GDP commitment to aid. That became almost the way to solve global poverty. I'm pleased and proud that over the last 10 years, the financial flows are moving. But I hope we've also learned that we've got to do much, much more than push aid at the problem. Aid is essential. Aid is important. But we all know trade is vital if we're going to build sustainable economies. Not just trade, but governance and the rule of law are absolutely essential. And governing institutions that are able to support mature democracies and economies. The whole climate change agenda is actually central to the future of agriculture in many of the poorest countries in the world. So maybe I can say to Derek, can he click onto the DFID website as well as to the FCO website and tell me what he thinks of it? The short answer to John is yes. I think the Arab Peace Initiative is a very important and significant statement. I met Amr Moussa, the General Secretary of the Arab League last week. I think that the initiative in respect of the Arab Peace Initiative is very important and very significant. And I think the prospect that there will be all of those Arab countries participating in the conference that President Bush is seeking to sponsor in the autumn is a very significant and positive development.
US-Saudi, if you want to touch that, but I don't know if you wanted the third question on US-Saudi, yes?
Well, I think you were saying about the Saudi.
Yes, sorry. Okay, I've got three questions. First, the gentleman here. If you just stand up, and that'd be great. Everyone.
Peter Marshall from Newsnight. You're having quite a week. First of all, your colleagues offend the Americans. Then you provoke this full-blown crisis with the Russians. Is this the new diplomacy?
I don't recognise that description. Is there a question there?
No, is it the new? I mean, it's a question of tone, really, isn't it? Has there been some ham-fistedness here, or is this just a coincidence of events?
Okay, I'll address that.
Okay. Sorry, there's a lady waiting in the front row there with a white shirt. Sorry, I've got to go with who I had up first. Please, stand up.
You talked about galvanizing the forces of moderation against radical extremism. In Iran today, there's an increasing attack against forces of moderation, including women, students, labor unions, teachers, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and even traditional Islam. You talked about sanctions and incentives regarding Iran's nuclear program and also foreign policy adventurism. What about Iran's record of human rights?
Thank you. And last question at the front here. There's microphones coming to the front. Thank you.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. I'd like to ask a question about Hamas. It's the hot topic in EU diplomacy at the moment. Should the EU change its policy of not talking to Hamas unless certain conditions are met? The reason being that the current policy seems to have helped the extremists in the Palestinian population and harmed the moderates. So my question is, do you see the EU policy on Hamas evolving? And linked to that, if it does evolve, do you think you can prevent that from creating a serious rift with the US, which is strongly opposed to engaging with Hamas?
Peter, I honestly don't recognise the description of the last 3 weeks, never mind the last week that you've described. At every stage, both the Prime Minister, myself, every other minister has been clear that British foreign policy will be firm, but it will not be macho. Yes, the last 3 weeks have set a number of tests, but I think that you've seen a very, very clear response from the British government, and you've seen a response that's been committed at every stage to work with countries right around the world in an open and engaged and straightforward way. And that is what will typify, I believe, the foreign policy that you will see from a Brown government. I'm sorry if I did. I think we met on earlier in the week to talk when you introduced yourself and talked about some of the work that you're doing. Obviously, I tried to address the importance of human rights and democratic accountability in the speech that I've just given. And I don't think we should be afraid to say that there are universal values and they need to be universally applied. And I think that's an important theme that was in my speech. In respect of Charles's question, the Quartet principles ask of Hamas what was asked of the PLO from 1967 right through until the early 1990s. And the period after the PLO decided that they would commit themselves to non-violence was the most intense, and I would say the most productive period of peacemaking and diplomacy that the Middle East has seen over the last 40 or 50 years. And it took us closer than at any time to the sort of two-state solution, a secure Israel, a viable and strong Palestinian state living side by side. It took us closer than at any other time. And what I would say is that we are asking of Hamas that they don't take us backwards to a pre-1990s situation. And I think it's important also to remember that the democratically elected president of the Palestinian Authority, that many neighbouring countries are very concerned that while it's right to say that the door should be open to discussion with Hamas, that should only be on the basis of a clear set of principles. And I think that in that context, it's right to say that the killing of 127 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip over the last 3 or 4 weeks is a very, very serious development, and one that has to be deplored. And we need a longer conversation, but I don't think it's right to put that violence at the door, either of the European Union or of others outside, because, not least because since February, the European Union has established clear relations with the National Unity Government there. It is a much longer topic, and I see that the clock has ticked to five, not because I've been trying to give long answers in order to avoid more questions, but if you'll excuse me, I think I'm going to have to call it a day there and let you make your final remarks.
Thank you, Rick. And final remark then, I think.
Well, thank you for coming here today. I wanted to do one last thing. It's sort of customary often to present speakers with books, and so we've written one. We asked our members to provide words of advice, warning, or encouragement to you, and we did set a word limit on contributions, but it's still a rather thick book. It's a little light reading for your office, and there will be a second edition coming out soon. The comments are still coming through.
Thanks very much indeed.
And thank you very much on behalf of Chatham House, all of our staff, the audience. We look forward to working with you next few months and sharing ideas. I'll leave you a quiet book to advertise that one. But thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for coming. Could you please remain seated so the Secretary can get out as quickly as possible to his train? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.